Welcome back to another 5 Fact Friday. I know this looks like I'm in the middle of a random field looking like a full scrub, but I am currently out at Heather's parents' farm. We just got done doing some farm work, and it's a good time to talk about this topic for our 5 Fact Friday. We're talking about grains today. This is one of the many perks coming to the country. Just get all of this beautiful views. Now we're in the middle of doing some work right now, so there's a lot of random stuff, but this is one of the things I love about the country. It's just nice, wide open, and quiet. Let's go. If you've never been to a 5 Fact Friday before, we share 5 fun facts about a specific whiskey or wine topic, and hopefully you're going to learn something. Today, like I said, we're talking about grains, and we're at a beautiful farm, so talking about grains just makes sense. When it comes to whiskey, grains are one of the biggest driving factors to it. That's where you're really going to get like a lot of your flavor from. That's what you use to make the alcohol. Without the grains, you're not going to get any alcohol. So let's start with bourbon and corn. When it comes to bourbon, this has to at least be 51% corn. Now, if you look at corn as a grain, historically, it's kind of interesting because in America, and everyone thinks of America, bourbon, synonymous, but bourbon and corn were not actually the first thing to be distilled here. It was actually rye whiskey. Rye whiskey was just really, really prevalent in that northeastern corner of the US for a long time. And then as people started to move further west, they had a lot of corn, and normally they'd be turning it into like some beer or something like that. They're like, okay, we can't do anything else, and our corn's getting eaten. There's rats and mice getting into our beer that we're making, so what happens if we distill corn? I.e., boom, there it is, you got your bourbon now. So that's when that started to come around. But if we look at it as just the grain itself, corn is actually a pretty sweet grain. You're gonna get a lot of sugar out of it. So one of my favorite things to look at is gonna be this guy here. I think it's pronounced like Nixta or something like that, but basically this is a heirloom grain corn from somewhere in Mexico, and it is incredibly sweet. This stuff is not going to be like just a white dog or something like that they'd get from a bourbon or a rye. This is just super, super sweet. And that's what happens when you just distill 100% corn. So if you had a corn whiskey, it's gonna be really sweet. You're gonna get a ton of sugar out of it, and it's just gonna boom, sugar. Which does make some really fun cocktails that I've had with this. It's a lot of fun, which I do need to tell you guys more about that sometime. But as we can see, corn is very sweet. So bourbon technically is a relatively sweet spirit, especially if you use majority corn. So you're using like 70, maybe 80% corn in there, and then a little bit of wheat and the malted barley. That's gonna be a really sweet bourbon. Now, speaking of bourbon, and the other part of it that's really big is the malt. So usually everyone uses malted barley, or if you've had like any single malt whiskeys, you always see this malt. But what is malt and what is malting? Malting is essentially where you take your grain and you make it easier for it to be consumed by the yeast. So let's look at first what yeast is actually doing and how the fermentation process happens. So in the fermentation process, we know the yeast has to be able to go attack the sugars that are inside of the grains, and it's going to turn that into alcohol. Now, if the yeast can't easily get into the grain and turn it into alcohol, then you're not going to get anything really good. So that's where malting comes into play. Malting is essentially where you take all your grains, you do all the stuff that you need to prep it, you put it on what's called a malting floor, and you wet it. By wetting it, it's going to start the germination process, where it's going to start to crack open and try to basically do what seed does and look for a spot to take root and grow. And right when that happens, you stop it with some heat. So you heat up that area, you stop that fermentation process, or excuse me, not the fermentation process, you stop the germination process, and boom, now you have a nice malted grain that you're going to be able to better use to make your spirits. If we didn't do this malting process, it would be really hard to get through and have a good product. You're not going to get a lot of alcohol out of it, and it's probably just going to taste really weird. One of those really hard grains is the next one we're going to talk about, rye. Rye is extremely tough, extremely hardy, and it doesn't work super nicely just to throw rye in typically, but people can. You do see some 100% malted rye, or like 95% rye and then 5% malted rye. Those whiskeys do exist out there, but they're not quite as common. Rye is typically going to be used as a flavoring grain if it is going to be put into a bourbon, or if you just have a rye whiskey. Most rye whiskeys that America is consuming are not going to be these 100% ryes, 95% ryes, unless you're obviously drinking the 95.5. But when it comes to the flavor profile that you're typically going to get out of rye, there's going to be a couple different areas that you're going to see. One, if it is associated with a higher amount of corn, it is going to come across very spearminty and very sweet. A lot of people kind of consider some of these ryes more desserty than more spirit forward. Now on the other side, there's going to be what we consider more the heirloom grain, where it's a little bit more spicy. You're going to get more of these clove, nutmeg, baking spice notes. So anytime someone says baking spice, just think of anything that you'd put into like a pumpkin pie basically, or a apple pie, and that's going to be kind of what they're talking about. Now on the other side of rye whiskey, there's the one everyone else knows about, wheat. So just think of wheat like you would wheat bread or most breads. Wheat is extremely soft. It's not going to be this heavy, hearty, aggressive grain. So you're not going to get a very heavy, aggressive flavor. It's going to be a very soft flavor. Now, when I say a soft flavor, I mean when you taste it, it's not aggressive. It's not going to hit you in the face with a ton of flavor notes. It's just going to be like, hey, we're here. Here's a little bit of sweetness. Maybe here's a little bit more of like that grain flavor. Here's just some very nice, well-rounded flavors. That's really what you're going to find most of the time when it comes to wheat. And I can really only say soft so many ways. It's just softer in comparison to something like rye, or if you have just a heavier aged bourbon that's got a little bit of that spice to it, wheat typically isn't going to have that. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is going to be hybrids versus heirlooms. You will see this every now and then, especially with more craft distilleries, where they're using what they call an heirloom grain. And you might be wondering, what the heck is an heirloom grain? For the most part, in the world of agriculture, we have very specific styles that we use for everything. So there's yellow corn that most people use. There's going to be the base type of wheat and the base type of rye, which are actually hybrids. So these were created to have a certain yield to it, and they were created to, again, have a certain flavor. And that's what everyone kind of just knows and associates if I say wheat, corn, or rye. But there are all of these heirloom grains out there, which are really, really cool. So the heirloom grains essentially are just going to be single varietals, if you will, of each of these grains. And they're going to have a lot heartier, of a flavor, and it's going to be a little bit more aggressive. So you get a lot more of these interesting flavor notes out of it, and it makes it a little bit more fun, if you ask me, but also it's a little bit more chaotic. These are going to be things like soft red wheat. It's going to be things like purple corn, dark pumpernickel rye. I did a video talking about far north and all of the ryes that they looked at to decide what type of rye they wanted to do. It is super, super nerdy. And this even goes into the barley. So if you have a single malt, you can make a single malt from a whole bunch of different strains of barley, distill them the same, age them the same, and they're probably going to taste wildly different. So when it comes down to it, yes, knowing the grains, it's a nerdy thing, but it is going to help you find what styles that you might like a little bit more. For me, I know I love my heirloom ryes. It makes it a little bit more interesting. They pack a little bit more of a punch, and I'm not going to get that spearminty note that I'm not really a big fan of. If you made it this far, I appreciate you guys. I'm glad you stuck it out all the way to the end. Drop a comment down below of what your favorite heirloom grain is, or something interesting that you know or have learned about the world of grain. If you guys could take a hot second, like this video, leave a comment like I just said, subscribe, I would really appreciate it. We're trying to drop videos every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. We've been lacking on our Wednesday videos a little bit, but our Fridays and our Mondays are still here. And then we're also going to be on TikTok and YouTube, essentially those same days, dropping more knowledge and some more fun stuff as well. But until then, guys, congrats, you made it to the weekend, and I'll see you on Monday. Cheers.